I would like to start by saying that this experience did not happen to me, but to my grandfather. I was always close to my grandfather. We stayed close up until his death. One thing that I admired most about my grandfather was his tough-as-nails attitude. He always carried himself with such confidence. I had never seen him afraid of anything, and I'd never seen him lose that fearlessness. Except for when he would talk about something that happened to him when he was a teenager. I heard him tell this story only a couple of times in my life, but when he would lose that fearless attitude I mentioned before. His voice would become shaky and quiet, and he would get this frightful look in his eye. The experience happened to him in the mid-1940s when he was around 14 or 15 years old. He grew up in a rural mountain town in Kentucky. One evening, he was taking the dirt road back to his house after visiting his older sister that lived a short distance from their family. It was beginning to get dark, so he hurried along, fearing his parents would begin to worry. To get home, he had to cross an old rickety wooden bridge that sat over a creek. Then, after the bridge, there was a split in the dirt path. Left would take him home. Right led God knows where. He began crossing the bridge. And by this time it was getting quite dark. Halfway across the bridge, he noticed what seemed to be a woman wearing a white nightgown that a woman back then would wear to bed. She also had long black hair that was well past her waist. My grandfather said this was especially strange, since during that time, women didn't leave the house as much like they do now, especially in the rural area he grew up in, and especially not in the evening as the sun was going down. And the fact that she was wearing bedclothes made it all the more strange. She was coming down the trail to the right. So my grandfather turned left and began to walk towards his home. She then turned onto the bridge and got halfway across it and stopped. It was then that the thought crossed my grandfather's mind that something may have been wrong. So living in the small rural area he figured he probably knew whoever this was. So he began to call out the names of all the women that lived near him. He also called out the names of his mother and sisters. The woman then turned toward him and began coming his way. He then noticed something that disturbed him. He said it looked like she was not taking steps. It's hard to explain, but he described it as her moving towards him, but her legs not taking any steps. They stayed perfectly still as she moved across the ground toward him. He was paralyzed with shock and fear. She then got within about 8 feet from him, and he noticed something that terrified him even more. She got close enough to him that with the short distance between them and the light from the moon, he noticed she did not have any facial features. It was like her face was just a smooth, flesh-colored surface. She had no eyes, no nose, no mouth. She had no facial features whatsoever. He said by then he was terrified, and he turned around and ran home as fast as he could. He said he didn't remember much of the sprint home. He only remembered being home, sitting on the floor of the kitchen, completely inconsolable. He said he remembers crying and shaking and feeling nauseous as his mother stood over him trying to figure out why he was in the state he was in. After a little time, when he had calmed down, he told the events to his family. His father and his siblings didn't pay him any mind, but his mother believed every word he said, partly because she was superstitious, but also because she was the only one to see how inconsolable he was when he arrived home. Time passed, and he never had seen again whatever the thing was. But he said that he will never forget what he saw, and that it still terrifies him to think about whatever it was on that mountain in the middle of the night. I've been hunting for 5 years. Before that, I was in the Army for 10, and before that, I was a scout on the biathlon team and into recreational hiking and camping. Suffice it to say, I've spent a lot of years off the beaten track. I'm in the low-risk category to get into trouble in the woods. I'm armed. I have bear spray. I have with me a radio or a mobile phone depending on proximity to cell towers, and possibly a GPS. And I always have a compass and maps. I know the woods and how to survive, and I don't spook easily. I typically hunt solo in massive tracts of crown land in northern Ontario. I've seen or heard wolves, coyotes, and mountain lions. I even saw a wolverine once. Black bears do not concern me. Moose are dangerous, but I keep my distance or shoot them as I'm typically hunting them. Unless I'm badly hurt, I really have nothing to fear from animals in the woods. Humans are the apex predator, after all, and it's good to be king. That being said, I am wary, but not afraid of other men I run into in the woods, and most of the time they're friendly and go on their way. Some are aggressive or drunk, but offering them a cigarette and kind words tends to calm those guys down. I'll share a couple of unexplained occurrences, however, that still chill me to this day. The first one happened a few years ago while I was solo hunting deer in the fall. I was camped for the night in a vast, frozen, swampy area. The only access was a decades-old logging track off the main road, and I was several kilometers from that track. There were no other hiking trails or other access, so I was sure I was quite alone. As a matter of fact, I hadn't seen or heard anyone else for 2 days. I had a good dinner and went to sleep as it started to lightly snow. I woke up with a start at 4:32 in the morning. I know the exact time because I looked at my watch. I could clearly hear sleigh bells, the kind Santa's reindeer wear. There were no other sounds except the wind and snow, no pre-dawn birds, footfalls, or snapping twigs, just eerie bells intermittently jingling. At first, I thought I was still dreaming, but I forced myself to check all my gear to prove to myself that I was awake. Then I sat there, shivering in my tent, praying that whatever was making that sound would go away. Going outside there to look wouldn't have helped. It was pitch black anyway. My mind was running through all the logical possibilities. I'm dreaming. It's a dog or a cat wearing a bell on its collar. It's an escaped reindeer. It's actually Santa. It's hikers wearing bells. My mind started to get away from me. I finally couldn't take it any longer, and I shouted out, "Whoever's ringing those damn bells can go away now." The bells abruptly stopped. I sat there, listening for another couple of hours, my mind racing, with chills arching down my spine. Thankfully, the bells never came back. When dawn broke, I scouted the area with my self-loading rifle, looking for a sign of who or what had passed in the dark. There was a fresh layer of snow on everything, so finding tracks would be easy. Not one track. Nothing, for hundreds of paces in every direction. I had been thorough. On discovering that, I broke camp and got the fuck out of there. Hunting was over for the season in that spot. Sure, I tried to laugh it off. "Scared out of the woods by Santa, you're such a little bitch," I said to myself. But I was truly spooked. A few years later, I was out for grouse, beating the bushes for those elusive gray birds. The area I was in was remote, but was cut in two by some high-voltage power lines and towers. I was walking the edge of one of those cuts, enjoying the sunny day and whistling. I really enjoy upland bird hunting. It's a relaxing way to spend the day and very casual as far as hunting goes. I wasn't surprised to hear ATV engines after some time, and I walked over to the one that stopped near me. "Seen any birds?" he practically yelled at me, still deafened by his engine. I offered my hand, and he shook it. "Hanson," he introduced, looking me up and down. "That's my surname." I chuckled and told him mine. He was an old dude. I'm middle-aged and getting on there, but he was old. We had a smoke and shot the breeze. His great-grandfather had established the first hunting camp in the area back in 1839, and they still ran it every fall. He knew those woods well. We compared shotguns, talked about the beautiful weather, and the usual bullshittery. When I found out they had no younger guys in their party, I was actually hoping for an invite to his camp for deer season and was angling the conversation that way. Get some tips and stories, new blood carrying on the tradition and all. "How long you been coming here?" He had cut me off, suddenly and sternly. "A couple of years," I said, "mostly for birds." "Then you've heard her." Her? What the fuck was he talking about? The witch. I couldn't help but smile at that, although his face was deadpan and serious. Right away I knew he was trying to spook me off his hunting spot with ghost stories, and just before deer season to boot. Fuck this old codger, what a dick. This is public property, after all. "So you're telling me a witch has haunted these woods since the 19th century, I was humoring him. "Yeah, something like that." He spit and put his smoke out with his boot. "Used to live in that abandoned farmhouse off the access road." I had seen the place before, a creepy pioneer log cabin, disused for generations. When my young son had been with me one day, he had refused to go near the place. He had complained that it made him feel all wrong. "You know she's nearby when you hear the sleigh bells." My blood froze. "Well, nice meeting you, Hanson. Thanks for the chat," I stammered and abruptly turned and walked back to the cut, and I could feel him staring at me the whole way. He eventually started his engine and rode away. What an asshole. How did he know that? Was this some sort of backwoods folklore about witches and sleigh bells? I walked straight to my truck and drove out of there. Fast. When I got home, I Googled it for hours and nothing came up. I eventually wrote it off as a coincidence and tried to push it out of my mind. Sometime later, I was packing for my deer hunt. I had buddies coming in from distant cities. It was going to be glorious, and I wouldn't have to go out alone. But then they all canceled, one by one. "Wife's in the hospital" was one story, more like "she's got your balls." Another one, "I had to work," the always busy and hectic doctor. That story was more believable. Another one was suddenly working nights. No matter, I was going anyway, and would send them pictures of my magnificent deer and regale them with stories for years whilst reminding them of their lame cancellations. I went back to the power lines area, as I had seen and followed many game trails during my bird hunting there. Besides, I sure as shit was not going back to the frozen swamp of witch bells, as I now called it. I knew Hanson and his mates would be around, but I knew where their camp was, and I was heading to the southeast, near Little Birch Lake, deep in the woods. I had butterflies in my stomach. Pretty common for me at the beginning of a season, all giddy with excitement, but they were more intense somehow. I tried not to think of Hanson's story. Then again, if Hanson had obviously survived years of hunting in the same woods, so would I. Fuck it, I went. Furthermore, the weather was nice, intermittent sun, and hovering around freezing. Overall, a nice day to go out into the woods. I wore a smile when I headed out. Now, if you've never been big game hunting in close country, in the bush, as it's known, it's rather slow going. You're wearing light boots and sneaking around, trying to make as little noise as possible. My buddy and I, we call it Last of the Mohican style. Every step is measured and placed carefully, toe to heel, to reduce noise. Your head's up, scanning around, ears straining for any hint of game sounds. You stop, just to listen frequently. The English call it still hunting or stalking. I much prefer it to sitting in a stand freezing your ass off all day. I proceeded southwest from the cut at my snail's pace. It probably took me all day to cover the 5 or 6 kilometers to the lake, but it was exhilarating, gliding silently through the bush like an expert tracker, taking in all the sights, sounds, and smells. The weather had soured over the course of the afternoon, clouding over and getting breezy. It was getting darker and colder. The late fall forest had come alive, swaying and creaking in the breeze. The change had been so gradual I hadn't even noticed it. The witch. It came unbidden into my mind. "Fuck you, Hanson," I muttered aloud. "You're not going to spook me." I realized at that point that I hadn't had a smoke all day. I lit one and sat down, trying to calm my nerves. It was helping. When I was putting it out, I saw something. A hint of black, an unusual color in the woods. Bear? I shouldered my rifle and clicked the safety off, peering through the illuminated reflex sight. "Just me, Bear. Go away now. You don't want to tangle with me." I started talking out loud in the manner I had learned to scare the elusive beasts away. But I wasn't taking any chances. I had a full magazine of .308 Accubons at my command, should it come to that. And I was an expert shot, having been shooting since I was a kid. I was standing now, in a firing stance, and stepping towards the black smear while talking. It didn't move as it came into full view. I lowered my rifle. Animal kill. I let out a sigh of relief and walked over to it, chuckling out loud at my nervousness. It was the scene of a bird's demise, a turkey, by the looks of it, and fresh. There had been a struggle, and there were feathers everywhere. A fox or a coyote had a good meal, that was for certain. One of its claws was left from the drumstick up. It had been gnawed off. I saw the other leg propped up against the tree nearby, and under it was the tail fan. I went to check it out. It looks unnatural. The fan had been cleanly severed from the bird, and the leg had been cut off at the joint. With a knife. The evil-looking claw had clearly been propped up against the tree by someone. I tossed the claw from between my fingertips, anxious to be rid of it. My mind began racing again. I was in the middle of nowhere, with no trails. "There are no witches," I mumbled as I stood up. I took a deep breath and pressed on, uncertainly. It was nearly dusk now, and the brackish small lake had come into view. The wind was gusting now, carrying with it the scent of putrid, semi-frozen water. I was still feeling rattled, but I resolved to find a spot, set up camp, build a big-ass fire, and drink the flask of brandy I had in my breast pocket, eat some food, and fall asleep. That would make everything better. I was nearing the edge of a clearing by the lake, feeling better about my situation when I heard a loud splash, sounding like something big had jumped into the water, closely followed by another one. Then nothing but the wind, as ripples spread across the water. I moved closer to see where they or it had gone, and then I heard them again. Sleigh bells. I could feel the tendrils of panic tightening around my chest and temples like the first time I had been in combat. My vision narrowed. "Fuck you, Hanson, I've had enough of your shit. You're not gonna scare me out of here. Hello? Come out here right fucking now," I shouted into the gloom. Yet I could see nothing for the trees. More bells. I'm not ashamed to admit that I fled. I shouted a curse and started back the way I came in. I grabbed at my compass, hanging from a lanyard at my shoulder. My hands were shaking as I tried to make out the luminous dial. The needle spun around at random, totally useless. I held my wrist with my other hand and tried to steady it. The bells continued. While breaking into a jog, I fumbled for my GPS and hit the backtrack button. It lit up trail to my truck. I could swear the bells were following me. "I'm warning you, quit following me." I had my rifle up now, aimed back towards the lake, but the bells didn't stop. I couldn't see anything by this point. It was pitch black. I realized the futility of threatening with a rifle in the dark, turned around, and continued stomping through the woods far too quickly, occasionally tripping and cursing. The bells started to subside, and then they stopped. Please make it to the truck. Please make it to the truck. I was chanting as I crashed through the tangle of woods. I finally regained enough composure to put a headlamp on so I wouldn't fall down as much. It took me seemingly forever to fight myself through the undergrowth, skinning my shins and knees and hands. I was chanting the whole way. When I finally got to the truck, I was certain nothing had followed me as I fumbled with the keys. More bells. I don't remember the drive home. Weeks passed, I calmed down. I was thankful that I wasn't harmed or hadn't gone missing, somewhat selfishly, but also for my family's sake. I had resolved to never go hunting alone again. I was watching TV with my wife one night. She was flipping channels. We'd be staying at home, making a big picnic in bed. Click. Missing hunters have been found after the search. Click. Wait, I yelled at her. Go back, go back. What's your problem? Jesus. Click. A provincial police officer's talking head appeared on the screen. Edward Hansen, 86, of Lanark County, and his brother Robert, 83, also from Lanark, have been found deceased weeks after the search for them had been called off. The coroner has ruled this to be an accidental drowning. No, 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 no. I was standing now, hands on my head. What's wrong, babe? Babe? After being found on the shore of a remote Little Birch Lake. No foul play is suspected, and we are not treating this as an active homicide investigation at this time. Anyone with information about their disappearance is urged to come forward. Imagine sleeping in a long trailer filled with 50 dudes and 2 sergeants to watch over everybody. Before we even knew about the ghost at the base, they told us about a cadet from last class who studied voodoo. The story went like this. As many of the cadets were taking showers, they had on one cadet sitting on his clothing chest talking to himself. They paid him no mind, just getting ready to go to bed and getting ready for the next day. The sergeant said they were outside talking about what pranks they were going to play on the cadets that night. As they talked, about 5 cadets came running outside and said something was wrong. They ran inside to see what was going on. That's when they saw the cadet in a stand-up locker with his back against the wall. He was very dark-skinned, but his eyes were red, and he was speaking a different language. They called the local MP to come and assist with this cadet. They told all the cadets to leave the housing. Mind you, it's 50 beds in one long trailer, 25 on each side. So as they waited for the police to arrive, they heard screaming and voices. Finally, the MPs arrived. When they walked in, the cadet was bent backwards while facing the door looking at them, eyes redder than a summer strawberry. They called more people to get backup, and once they arrived, they went in and grabbed him. I'm not sure what was going on or who else was in there. Finally, they got a hold of him. They put him in a van and told him everything would be okay. He insisted that he lay flat on the floor so they wouldn't get him. And while they drove off the base, he started to scream, saying, "They're coming to get me. They're coming out of the woods. I can see them. I can see them." Nobody else said anything. It turns out that every night, while everyone else was asleep, he practiced voodoo, just like his father and grandmother did. And apparently he contacted some spirits and let them into his world. And back to my story. One night, we had to move some bunks down because some of the cadets were leaving. I told the sergeants I wanted to be on a top bunk. I was the only one who slept on one. I felt like a king. So one night, as I slept, I rolled over to look at the other end, to see that a sergeant was watching us that night. But inside, I saw white figures standing beside everybody's bed. I wasn't sure what was going on. I tried to rub my eyes because everything was blurry, and I knew I had to be dreaming. I believed in ghosts, but I didn't know what to expect. I didn't want to make any movements that might draw their attention to me, so I just rolled over. Next to my bunk bed, which was against the wall, was the sergeant's office, where they sat and watched everything. It was a small room, but it had huge windows so they could just watch everything that was going on. As I looked, I saw somebody, but I only saw them from the chest down, and they had on a hat. They were all in black, kind of like somebody wearing a trench coat. I rubbed my eyes one more time, not sure if I was dreaming or not. I tapped my bottom bunkmate to wake him up, but I didn't take my eyes off of this man in the trench coat. I thought that if I turned around, the white figures would be up close to my face because they knew I was awake, or even the man in the back would be closer to my face, so I didn't want to be loud, and I didn't want to move my eyes. My bunkmate wouldn't wake up, and Trenchcoat was moving closer and closer. I didn't know what to do. My body went numb, my skin started to get hot. I felt the cold energy in the room. I felt something grab my hand. It was cold, and I couldn't pull my hand out of their grip. I didn't know what to say, or to do, or to believe. I let out a scream, but nothing came out. My bunkmate was still snoring away, so I knew he didn't have the grip on my hand. I rolled over, and it was in my face. The white figure was in my face. I looked at it, and it was so bright I couldn't see. I just saw the shape of a young boy, and many of these other boys behind him. I heard him speak. My eyes were as wide as a bowling ball. He told me that they stood behind and beside our beds to protect us, and that they weren't going to harm anybody, that they were protecting us from him. I suddenly went to sleep, and I can't remember anything from that moment on. Every now and then I get a visit from the young boy that I named Gordon. He's my friend now. I like a good ghost story, so here's one for you. It's a little long, but bear with me. When I was younger, there were these series of books called Haunted Philippines and True Philippine Ghost Stories that contained ghost stories and paranormal experiences from various people across the country. Some stories were in English, while the rest were in Tagalog. They were quick to read and had numerous volumes. Sometimes they even had a section of ghost pictures near the end. You know the kind. Nonchalant landscape or family pictures with a blurry figure circled in red. Some of them actually looked convincing, downright creepy. I loved that series, though I should have enjoyed them while they lasted. As of last year, they seem to have been discontinued and are difficult to find in bookstores now. To me, these books were just good entertainment. Growing up in the Philippines provided no shortage of ghost stories and mythical legends. It seemed like everyone had a story to tell or knew someone who had one. I've had a handful of relatives in my family who claimed to have had encounters with a ghost, or multo, as we called them in our native tongue. I never thought I'd have my own stories to share, but that quickly changed very recently. My family and I had recently taken a trip back to the Philippines. It was long overdue, as I had not seen my relatives and my home country in several years. It was a bit strange to see all my younger cousins grown up. It was a great experience just to see them all again and spend time with them. On our first week there, we were on our way back to my aunt's house from a long day of shopping when the conversation in the car turned to supernatural occurrences. Our culture is heavy on religion and tradition, and we can be very superstitious at times. There are numerous stories of mythical monsters in Filipino culture, and hearing about them from my parents and relatives only furthered my interest. They included such things as the Tikbalang, which was a monster that frequented the forests in the mountains. It is described as a large humanoid creature with the head and limbs of a horse, so basically BoJack Horseman. The Kapre was more of a tale for kids. It's described as a tall, troll-like creature that resides in large trees where it smokes a cigar, waiting to scare off children that are out too late at night. He's usually regarded as non-violent, though. Another one is a Tiyanak, and they're the stuff of nightmares. In remote areas near forests, you'd hear the faint crying of a baby. If you followed these sounds deep into the woods, it could lead you to be perpetually lost. Or, if you were really unlucky, you'd find the source. You'd stumble upon what looks like a baby on the ground, but in actuality it's a small, ghastly creature that will transform and eat you if you got too close. Then there's the Aswang, a shapeshifter that feeds on human flesh at night. A specific species of them, called a Mananagal, which translates literally to remover, is a particularly terrifying one. By day they are in the form of a regular woman, but by night they feed. They root their legs to the ground as their top half detaches itself, sprouts bat-like wings, and takes flight. They mainly target pregnant women, and they have a long, vine-like tongue that slithers down and eats the fetus as they hover right outside the window. I know, pretty crazy stuff, right? I've always regarded these tales with a healthy amount of salt and a full dose of fear. They were cool and unique, but I could happily live the rest of my life not encountering any of them if they were indeed real. Even when I moved to America, I was still wary of those regional creatures. Anyways, during the car ride, my cousins spoke of strange sightings and experiences they had all had, all with varying degrees of believability and silliness. My dad relayed some tales from his younger years about how his group of friends would encounter this and that. He was always ever so dramatic with his storytelling. It was all in good fun, but throughout the whole conversation my mom remained quiet. She was the hard skeptic type, and would always dismiss those stories as silly folklore. However, at that moment it looked like she had something to say. My curiosity took over, and I finally asked her if she had ever had any ghostly encounters. She just looked at me and nodded. Back during her college years, when she was studying to be a nurse, she lived on the campus of a very old school not too far from the city I was born in. Living conditions were pretty rough, and 4 of them had to share a room half the size of a normal American college dorm. On top of that, the campus used to be an infirmary during World War II. Hundreds of soldiers from both sides passed through and died within the walls of that hospital. Residents of the dorms would speak of strange noises in the night. Footsteps, faint echoes, and knocking were heard in certain parts of the building. There were rumors that the place was also a temporary orphanage at one point in time, and that a handful of children had died there. They said you could hear children's laughter in the walls if you listened closely. On more than one occasion, my mom and her roommates would wake up to faint shuffling noises in the room, like someone small was moving about. When they looked around, they wouldn't see anyone, so they dismissed it and went back to sleep. It wouldn't be until the following morning that they saw what looked like footprints on the walls and ceiling. They were the size of a child's. One of her roommates moved out after that. One night, a close friend of my mom was heading back to her room after a late-night study session. She was wary of the supernatural, so she kept her head down and walked quickly through the halls. As she passed by one of the empty rooms, something caught her eye. That large room used to be a triage area, when the place was still a hospital. The old rusted beds were left there, abandoned, and the room was used for storage. She said she saw half a dozen men lying on the beds. They looked injured and bandaged, and they wore what looked like the uniform of an American soldier from World War II. She stood frozen in place as she felt the coldest chill she'd ever experienced in her life. Then one of the soldiers sat straight up and slowly turned towards her. That was enough to snap her back to her senses, and she took off running towards her room. When she got to her dorm and told her friends what she saw, the brave ones of the group headed to the room to investigate. But when they got there, all the beds were empty. Ever the skeptic, my mom didn't put much stock into these stories. That is, until one early morning when she experienced something that challenged her stance and bothers her to this day. In the mornings before classes, my mom would wake up extra early so she could get first dibs on the showers in the community bathrooms. It wasn't too hard since a lot of the residents had convinced themselves that the place really was haunted and were unwilling to venture out of their rooms that early. My mom mostly ignored the stories, and she always got to class early. That morning, she did her usual routine, and it went off without a hitch. As she was walking back to her room, she heard it. She said it sounded like whispers. She stopped and turned around. Down the hallway, a figure stood just at the edge of the darkness. The lights weren't in the best condition in that wing, so it was dim. Still, my mom could discern that the figure was dressed like a nun. That didn't make any sense, since there were no nuns on campus, and the nearest church was several miles away. Staying completely calm, my mom turned and walked away. She quickened her pace, and her own footsteps echoed in the empty hall. She strained to hear any other noises, but heard none. When she turned right to another hallway, she saw the nun from the corner of her eye. It was closer, and definitely following her. As she got closer to her dorm, she turned around once more. The nun was at the end of the hall, just as far away from her as when she had first seen it. The nun stood still, as if she'd been standing there the whole time. My mom quickly reached her door and struggled to unlock it. Daring one more look, she turned to her left, but the nun was gone. Relieved, she turned the lock. As she did, she moved to pick up her stuff and felt an unnaturally cold chill. She slowly looked right, and it was right there. The nun, on the other end of the hall, except now she was much closer and fully in the light. On instinct, my mom turned the knob and threw her door open, and that's when the child ran out. A small, kindergarten-aged child ran out of her dorm room, brushed past her leg, and ran towards the nun. The child was laughing innocently, as if playing a game of tag. My mom watched as the child ran past the nun and disappeared into another room. After a few moments, the nun turned and followed the child. My mom asked around after that experience and learned that the last time there were children or nuns in the campus was back when it was a temporary orphanage several years ago. They shut it down after a tragic fire killed a dozen children and a few nuns looking after them. She never experienced anything else out of the ordinary after that. After she told that story, we all sat stunned in our seats. My mom had been holding out on me. I was thrilled, but also terrified of what I'd just heard. See, at the time, I had a passive interest in the paranormal. It wasn't anything serious, and nowhere near obsession levels. I wasn't out to prove that the afterlife existed, nor was I determined to find out if ghosts and spirits were real, to find some sort of meaning in this chaotic world. Did I believe in the supernatural? Not really, but I'd be open to the possibility. My interest in the subject was purely recreational, like someone who enjoys horror movies or knitting sweaters. In fact, while I like reading up on urban legends and enjoy hearing ghost stories, I was also terrified by them. My imagination, fueled by stuff I've read and scary movies I've watched, would always get the better of me. When I'm home alone or alone in the dark. It was a sort of interesting paradox, kind of like how at one point in my childhood I was fascinated by snakes as animals, but I was deathly afraid of encountering one out in the wild. And to be honest, I was still a little bit jealous of my mom that she had such a cool story to tell. I wished at the moment I had my own story. Well, you know what they say about being careful what you wish for, yeah? Later on in the trip, we visited my uncle, who lived a few towns over. There he lived with his family, where he ran a very lucrative farming business. On the way there, we passed a long bridge that went over a steep ravine with a river below. As our car rode along the bridge, I couldn't help but sense déjà vu. I mean, it made sense since I'd traveled over this bridge many times before when I visited my uncles and cousins. However, underneath that feeling was a sense of unadulterated fear and dread, like something bad had happened here, and it somehow directly affected me. A distant memory, screaming to be remembered. As if on cue, my dad pointed out that this bridge was the infamous one where the surrounding towns and cities talked about all the time because of the White Lady. Now, like the Copre or the Tikbalang, the White Lady is another one of the ubiquitous ghost stories told all around the country. She is perhaps the most well-known, since different countries also have their own version. In America, she's usually called the Lady in White. In Spanish cultures, she's La Llorona. The basic idea remains the same. A ghostly-looking woman dressed in a long white dress and long dark hair stands on the side of isolated roads waiting to hitch a ride. The scenarios vary, but in the Philippines, if you stopped and gave her a ride, she would quietly enter your back seat. If you don't interact with her, she'll leave you alone, until she disappears from your car some distance later. If you see her on the road and keep driving, she will suddenly appear in your car and attack you. Moral is, it's better to give her a ride than to not. When we arrived at my uncle's large house, I couldn't shake the feeling that the bridge had somehow directly affected me. After a delicious dinner and a round of video games with my cousins, I found my uncle out in the balcony having a drink. He offered me a beer since I was finally old enough, and I took a seat next to him. "Hey Tito, do you remember anything about that bridge right outside of town?" He put his drink down and regarded me for a few moments, and then he cut straight to the chase. "You were really young when it happened. I suppose you didn't remember it much." Now I was fully intrigued. I had to know. What exactly happened? His warm smile faded, and he told his tale. As the story went on, the memories began to flood my mind. Memories that I had long since repressed as a defense mechanism. All the details came to me in excruciating clarity as if it happened just yesterday. By the time he had finished the story, there was no denying it. I had encountered a ghost all those years ago. It was in the mid-90s, and I was still living in the Philippines. I was a plucky 6-year-old that was all about adventure and exploring. Once or twice a week I would spend the night at my uncle's farm, back then a small budding business. The town it was in was similar then, smaller, though, and fairly remote. I loved that place because there were so many areas to explore, but only in the daytime. One particular night, I was over at his place, just watching TV. My uncle got a call of a new delivery of chicken feed that needed to be picked up in the next town. At the time, he only had a few farmhands, and they all had the night off. Usually he wouldn't make a supply run this late at night, but he was behind schedule and needed to pick up the supplies or risk losing profit. As he headed out, he asked me if I wanted to tag along. Ever the restless child, I immediately agreed. My uncle had an old Toyota SUV that he used for all his delivery pickups. I sat in the second row, my usual spot, while my uncle slid into the driver's seat. Most of the voyage was uneventful. It was nearly 11 p.m. at night, so there was hardly any other vehicle on the road. Upon crossing the bridge the first time, nothing happened. During that time, the bridge was newly constructed. It was put up the year before, after the original bridge was ravaged by the last typhoon. The city even put streetlights on the new bridge for better visibility. That was a huge deal, since none of the other surrounding roads had streetlights. We arrived at the next town, and I helped my uncle load up the supplies. Well, at least as much as a small 6-year-old can. On the way back home was when it happened. I was sitting in the back seat, absent-mindedly looking out the window when I felt the car slow down. We were almost at the bridge and I noticed something wasn't right. I was too small to see over the seat and out the windshield, but I could tell that all the lights on the bridge were off. At this point, the car slowed to a crawl. Hey, sport, why don't you lie down and take a little nap? My uncle said from the front. Something in his voice didn't sound right. It sounded like he was scared and was struggling to hide it. No, that's okay. I'm not tired, I said. Please, just do it for me, okay? He sounded stern but measured. My uncle was usually an easygoing guy, so when he got serious, you knew you should pay attention. Okay, I said, as I laid down on the seat. I briefly saw my uncle's eyes in the rearview mirror. They showed unmistakable fear. I felt the familiar bump that signaled that we were on the bridge, and then the car stopped. Close your eyes, okay? No matter what, you keep them closed. Okay, I said. I started to get scared. I didn't know what was happening or why I had to close my eyes, but regardless, I shut them tight. And then the strangest thing happened. My uncle started to sing. It was a traditional Filipino folk song, and I'd only heard it once before. About a year ago, my aunt and uncle got into a shouting match, as in a things were thrown across the room type of shouting match. Yeah. I was at their house at the time, and my cousins and I stayed in their room, cowering and waiting for the storm to pass. An hour later, my uncle entered the room and apologized for the shouting. He then started singing that song to lull us to sleep. The melody was beautiful, and I'd never known my uncle could sing that well, and he never did it again. At least not until that moment when we were on that dark bridge. The song sounded just as beautiful, but I could tell his voice was shaking. His car wasn't that big, but I was a small child, and there was a lot of room in the second row. I was lying down on the seat perpendicular to the windows, trying and hoping for sleep to come. But instead, something else arrived. Click, click. I heard the familiar mechanism of the headlights flashing. All of a sudden, I sensed that I wasn't alone in the second row anymore. My spatial awareness of the car told me that there was someone or something else sitting right next to me. We had gained another passenger. I shut my eyes even tighter as my uncle began to drive. The temperature inside the car became cold. I curled myself into a ball, seeking refuge from whatever it was that was now right next to me. I didn't know much about ghosts and supernatural creatures at that age, and though I couldn't see it, something told me that I was in the presence of something that was not of this world. My uncle finished the song and started over again. I was amazed that he was able to keep his composure. I refused to open my eyes. I could hear her, so uncomfortably close next to me. At first, I heard what sounded like clicking. As it increased in volume, it sounded like stalks of celery being twisted and broken. Crack, 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 crack. It was unnerving. Those sounds weren't normal, and they were all around me. We finally crossed the bridge, but she was still there. I was so scared I could barely move. The car hit a bump, which caused me to slide to the side, closer to her, and I felt damp cloth against my leg. My breath became shallow, and I began to cry. I don't know what compelled me to do it, but I opened my eyes for a split second, and in that split second, I saw her. A brief flash of white with stringy damp hair on her head, blacker than night. She was turned away from me. I blinked the tears from my eyes, and when I opened them again, the mass of black hair was now right in front of my face. I shut my eyes tight again. After what seemed like an eternity, the car hit a familiar curve on the road that signaled the entrance to our town. I felt that entity come even closer to me. By this time, my uncle was silent. No more songs. The air became even colder right next to my face, and I shook, not from the cold but from terror. And then she spoke, right into my ear. It was a hushed whisper, lower than any whisper I've ever heard. I couldn't make out what she said. It didn't sound threatening or angry. It sounded sad. And then she was gone. I immediately felt the difference. I could no longer feel another presence in the car, and the air went from cold to tropical humid again. I heard my uncle breathe a sigh of relief. I didn't open my eyes until we had reached the safety of the farm. My uncle had to carry me back inside and straight into bed, and only then did I open my eyes. From what I could recall, we never spoke of that night to anyone, not even to each other, ever again. Subsequent trips across the bridge at night never resulted in another White Lady sighting, at least not for me. I would find out later that in the early 80s, a woman was found dead at the bottom of that bridge. People said that she was traveling to the next town and was hoping to catch a ride with any passing vehicles. It was late at night, and she had no family nearby that could give her a ride. No one knows what really happened, but many suspect that it was murder. After my trip back to the Philippines, I couldn't stop thinking about that night at the bridge. How could I forget such an incredible and terrifying experience? I guess it doesn't matter, since I remember it now. But there was something else I realized about that night. Something I hadn't remembered before. When I heard her whisper, I thought I only heard unintelligible garble, but that's not true. She did say something. She said, "Maraming salamat." Translated into English, that means, "Thank you very much." I work as a curator for an art gallery in Japan. In Japan, even in the most modernized city of Tokyo, everyone believes in ghosts. Even the most secular Japanese would be afraid of staying alone in places like the office due to the existence of the ghost that peers at you from the dark spaces in between. These eyes can be anywhere. The narrow space in between bookshelves, a slightly open drawer, etc. My story started late one evening, when I had to stay past closing time to complete an assignment given to me by my repulsive boss. He was a fat, balding, sexist man who had an unrealistic idea of his own importance, and he expected any assignments given to be completed on the day itself. As I said, I was alone in the gallery on that day when I heard a soft tapping sound, which seemed to come from behind a painting. I dismissed it as some internal dripping of water within the wall and went on completing my assignment. The dripping got louder and louder, and I became increasingly frightened. Still, the assignment had to be completed. To quiet the disquiet in my heart, I decided to play some music in the office. However, after about 30 minutes, I heard a strange voice coming from the direction of the painting. It was voiced in a monotonous pitch, and it sounded human, but with an unhuman quality. Mind you, the entire gallery space was dark with the lights switched off. Only the office had lights on. I wanted to leave at this point, and I couldn't shake off the cold fear I felt at the back of my neck. However, to leave the office, I had to switch on the security system, which was located at the back of the gallery space, near the painting, which incidentally was a portrait piece. The painting featured a woman in a dress from the Victorian period, clutching a fan to her chest. I was at a loss for what to do. So nothing happened at this point to end my dilemma. As I stood looking towards the dark gallery space, almost drowning in stupefying fear, I thought I saw something glisten from the painting. It seemed white in color to me. I decided to pluck up my courage to investigate. I didn't take more than 20 steps until I realized what it was. The glistening white came from the rolling eyeballs of the lady in the portrait, who was trying to roll her eyes at me to direct her gaze on me. Her eyeballs were the only part of her body that could move. The rest of her, including her head, was facing the opposite direction from me. For some reason I knew that if her gaze fell on me, that would be the end of my existence on Earth. Job or not, this was too much for me, and I turned and ran out of the gallery. The next morning, bright and early, I went back to the gallery. Although I had run out without locking the doors, every painting was still in place, even the painting of the portrait. The only difference is, The painting is now a blank. The Victorian lady had managed to extricate herself from the painting and fled in the night. I lived in Long Beach, California for about 5 years. I lived in several places, but the first place I moved to with my boyfriend was near Wilson High School, if you know where that is. Anyway, we rented a bungalow that was behind a main house. If you're familiar with Long Beach, there are a lot of rentals like this. This was a two-bedroom house. The second bedroom we used for an office, and we both felt that that room was the most active. Our cat would always go into that room and stare at the wall as if it could see something that we couldn't. One night, I couldn't sleep, so I went out into the living room to watch a little TV. While I was sitting on the couch, out of the corner of my eye, I saw someone walk from our bedroom into the office. When I went to check, there was no one there, and my boyfriend was fast asleep. We had friends that lived across the street from us, and their house had weird things happen, which makes me believe the street we lived on was haunted. It was about 10 years ago. I was a 21-year-old naive goth girl who always had a fascination with the occult ever since I was very young. I lived in my first apartment in Connecticut with my now ex-boyfriend. My ex and I shared a love of great music, alcohol, and visiting beautiful cemeteries at 3 a.m. to be mischievous, adventurous, and naughty at times. One night in particular, we had made our own Ouija board using a glass as the planchette. Needless to say, it was uneventful, so we put it back in the car and drove home. When we arrived, it had just turned 4 in the morning, and our neighborhood was absolutely silent. Pitch black. Everyone had their lights out. We walked into the back door, which had a window on it, and closed it, and began to walk up the stairs. Before we got to the top, we froze in horror at what we heard. It sounded like a hand, slamming on the door window and dragging its hand down the glass slowly. It repeated this 3 more times. Our hearts jumped to our throats, and we stood in silence, in complete fear for what seemed like forever. We whispered back and forth, shaking and completely confused. I screamed, "Go away! You're not allowed in!" And for the rest of the night we heard nothing. I still don't know what happened that night, but that was the night I truly believed in spirits. In November of 2018, my sister, dad, and I moved out of this old house and moved where we are now. I think this house is haunted, due to lots of reasons. When we first moved here, I woke up at around 12:30 in the morning to a light switch going on, off, on, off. I was really scared at this point because this type of crap happened at the old house, which was also haunted. I woke up to tell my dad what happened, and he was like, that's weird. This happens all the time now, and when it happens, I usually don't think anything of it anymore. In December, I woke up to one of my dogs jumping on my bed. I got up and noticed that the door next to my bed, next to the furnace, was open. My room is in the basement. I was shaking. I was about to go in there, and then I just thought, hell no. So I got up and closed the door, and then I heard the light switch, on, then off, almost immediately. At this point, I didn't fall asleep again for almost 2 hours. A few weeks ago, I was home alone. My dad was off at my sister's dance practice. I was drawing in my room, and I heard a door open upstairs. I ran upstairs to greet my sister and dad, but they weren't home. At this point, I almost called 911 because I was so freaked out. Around 2 weeks ago, I woke up to somebody doing the dishes at 4 in the morning. I fell asleep shortly after because I was exhausted and didn't think much of it, until I realized that nobody's awake at 4. and no one does the dishes at 4 in the morning. So, when I was about 8 years old, I was laying in bed, and I saw this little person come walking across my sheets towards me. He was all white like a ghost, but the size of an action figure. And naturally, I freaked out and told it to leave me alone, but I don't think it did. Things happen that I can't explain. When I'm using a remote control, the channel will either go one higher or lower without me ever touching it. While I'm using my phone, there are times when I get so frustrated because things won't work. It's like someone else is touching the screen at the same time. Just little annoyances that I notice and try to brush off, but it's getting harder and harder to do that. The one thing I notice the most is that when I'm laying in bed, and if anyone has pets, you know how it feels when they walk on the bed. The motions around your legs tell you something is moving, but nothing is there yet. I feel that all the time, even when it's not my dog. In the pitch dark, I have felt hands touching my feet. I am really starting to believe that someone has placed a curse on me or attached a fiend to me that loves to annoy the hell out of me with these little things that just get to me. I'm trying to explain this without sounding like a crazy person, but I know I feel something walking on the bed at times when I'm laying down. I do have a small dog that sleeps with me every night. Her name is Samantha, and she was my mother's until she passed away. And there are times when she growls at nothing. Having her walk on the bed taught me how it feels when something else is walking on it when I'm laying down. This happens almost every night, even when Samantha is sleeping right next to me. Other things happen as well, but it's the small annoyances that are the worst. Finally getting on the right channel only to have it switch again without touching it, turning the sound off on my phone only to have it turn back on seconds later without touching it, having my phone in my pocket and suddenly it's calling somebody on my contact list, which wouldn't be that weird except it calls somebody way further down than the last person I called. I'll put my phone away after talking to somebody, and a minute later I hear hello, hello from my pocket, and it's somebody on my list that was nowhere near the person I last talked to. So many times my phone has called out to people as I'm carrying it or have it in a pocket, fingers nowhere near the screen, so nothing should be able to press send a call. I could put my phone away after playing Candy Crush, and a minute later it's calling somebody from my pocket, so how does that work? The walking feeling I get when I'm laying on my bed is what's making me believe I'm haunted or cursed, that there is an invisible entity attached to me that does little things to drive me crazy. Has anyone else ever had something like this happen? And if so, how would you get it to stop? I'm seriously going crazier by the day. My bedroom door is slightly ajar until just a moment ago, when it fully closed by itself. The click was as loud as it could be. The little metal part popped back out into its little hole in the wall. Damn, it must know I'm talking about it. My dream is that the more I talk about it, the sillier it'll seem and it'll just go away, but I doubt I'm that lucky. By itself, this story sounds crazy, I know. I probably should have started by telling you that I'm an empath, destined to be a medicine man. Since I was a child, I have seen shadow people and have been able to guess the things that are about to happen, and then they do.